Hello and welcome to the Plant Paradigm Podcast, where we have inspiring conversations with amazing individuals from all around the world and look for ways to create a clean, green, and sustainable future for us, the planet, and all beings. I'm your host, Tom Simak, a fellow plant eater who strives to optimize every living ecosystem, passionate about looking after this beautiful floating rock we call home and all the lovely creatures that dwell among it. Today's conversation is with none other than Dr. Matthew Nagra, ND. If you've heard Dr. Nagra before in a podcast or maybe seen him on Instagram, you'll know that he is a deep, ever-expanding well of knowledge. And that's exactly what we'll be taking advantage of today. Nutrition feels like the most complicated field ever because of how much it's laced in marketing budgets. That's a big reason I was very excited to dive into his perspective. We'll be touching on the ever-evolving field of health, but we'll be spending the majority of time simplifying health down to the core little nuggets that are easy to remember. But of course, who doesn't love busting a few myths? So we'll be talking about keto, we'll touch on that a fair bit, and we'll be talking about the recent studies that have come out that have linked vegans and vegetarians to higher stroke risk. We'll also be talking about, well, what are the reasons people would actually go vegan and vegetarian? What is the actual science that says this is good for us? And how is it good for us? So really finding the elevator pitch. So when someone asks you, why are you eating more plants? Why are you excluding this animal protein source from your diet? That's just so stupid. So we're going to tackle those points exactly so that we can all be armed with the right information when we're having these important discussions. Just a reminder for those visually inclined, this does go up on YouTube. And of course, for more visuals, our Instagram at plant.paradigm has little snippets of the conversation that I've found really helpful. So we post that all there and we talk about the episode and continue the conversation over there essentially. With that being said, let's just get into the episode and I will see you guys on the other side. Dr. Matthew Nagra, welcome to the Plant Paradigm Podcast. How are you going?
I'm good, thanks. Thanks for having me.
Welcome. What's new in your world?
Nothing. Just got my COVID shot this morning. So that's new. And then the rest of it's all the same. Just working, exercising, doing whatever I can during these crazy times.
You definitely try really hard to keep healthy. And look, I'm just going to get straight into it with the science because based on my research on you, you like to be quite direct. So I'm going to match that for you. Okay. Look, when we're looking at the evidence, and I'm curious to know what your opinion is on this, we can see that there's an overwhelming amount that's kind of leaning towards, hey, Wholefoods plant-based is probably the best thing you can do for your body. Do you think there's like a possibility of there ever being the opposite coming out and being like plant-based is actually harmful for your body? Is that possible at all?
There is absolutely zero chance of that as far as plant predominant to plant exclusive diet. So that's where the evidence is. The evidence shows that a plant predominant to a plant exclusive diet, meaning, I mean, we can argue about percentages, but let's say around 85% up to 100% plant-based, whole plant foods predominantly is what seems to be ideal. Now, is there chance that we have data coming out showing that 100% is actually a little bit better than that 85, 90%? Maybe. Is there evidence coming out that the opposite, or is it possible the evidence could come out saying the opposite, where having a little bit of animal products is maybe better than excluding altogether? Possibly. If that ever comes out, it's going to be such a small impact on your overall health. And so for now, let's just stick to what we know. And we know that that's the pattern we want to follow, either predominantly or exclusively plants. Obviously, if you're eating exclusively plants, or even if you're eating animal products with irregularity, take a B12 supplement, take care of that. And otherwise, off you go.
On that kind of note, you're obviously you're an acting clinician and a naturopathic doctor. So you've got this direct relationship with patients. Are you ever getting backlash or like something of that form when you're talking to clients and they're like, oh yeah, no, like, do you still struggle with that?
So a lot of people come to me because they know I'm plant-based. So that's kind of a benefit I have. They know what I'm about. They want to come see me for that reason. So I don't have pushback from them. Now I will get some people, maybe their partners or their parents or, whoever twists their arm, get them to come in. And they might be a bit more hesitant, but if they are hesitant, I'll chat with them about it. Like, so let's say that they're wanting to prevent cardiovascular disease, or maybe they've had a recent, let's say, heart attack, and they want to do their best there. I'll talk about, look, we have this evidence for, strictly whole foods or almost strictly whole foods plant-based diet. We have this evidence for a Mediterranean diet. Both seem to be really good. If even that's too much, then whatever shifts we can make, let's say we get the processed meat out of your diet. Let's get some of the refined carbohydrates, replace them with whole grains, that kind of thing. We can make these small steps, and I let them know that each step they take is going to be a benefit, but obviously this is the end goal. This is where we want to end up. So that's one approach. Now, the other thing that happens sometimes is I'll have people come in where they've done their Googling, and they'll come across stuff about polyunsaturated fats are harmful apparently, and saturated fats fine, and butter is back and all that stuff. So I'll have to actually walk them through where these claims come from. I've got this huge folder on my computer with all my data and stuff. I'll pull them up. I'll show them like the graphs and the tables and stuff to kind of help wrap their heads around why I'm suggesting what I am suggesting versus just telling them something. And I think that's a benefit I have in the way that I practice, because I spend a lot of time with patients. Like, an initial visit will be an hour. Follow-ups can vary in time, but usually say half hour. So I get a lot more than that quick, 15 minutes with people. So I can really dive into that sort of thing.
I want to ask you about this saturated fat thing, because sometimes I have these, let's call them heated discussions in the comment section with people who seem to be convinced that saturated fat and LDL is good for the body. Like, where do these people come from? Where are they getting this information? And does that have some sort of leg to stand on? Like, surely it's not just poof, it's just made up. There has to be somewhere that this came from.
Yeah. So there's two things. Let's touch LDL first. So LDL cholesterol, it causes heart disease, causes atherosclerosis. We know that. We have data from genetic studies, from cohort studies, from randomized controlled trials. We know that that's the case. So this idea that low cholesterol or low LDL is actually bad for you and that you want to have it higher actually comes from data on elderly populations. So when we look at older populations and we look at their LDL levels, there's a lot of times where actually lower LDL levels will signify worse health, and they'll actually have higher mortality rates. The reason that is because as you get sick, if you end up with cancer or other diseases, your LDL can actually drop. So they're sick, causing their LDL to drop. And then obviously the low LDL is going to be associated with poorer health outcomes. But it's not the low LDL causing the health issue. And that's where they mess up. Now we have multiple Mendelian randomization experiments. This is looking at genetically determined LDL levels. And we find that actually lower LDL is associated with greater longevity, higher LDL, earlier death. And so that should really be the final nail in the coffin, because that's lifelong. That's not considering that, later in life you get sick, your LDL drops. We're like, no, lifelong from birth till death, your LDLs are lower and you tend to do better. So that kind of gets rid of that issue. The saturated fat one, I mean, there's a few angles that people take with this. There are some studies that do something called an over adjustment. So if you look at saturated fat consumption and heart disease risk, for example, we know that saturated fat raises your LDL cholesterol, and then higher LDL, like I just said, causes heart disease. Well, they'll do this adjustment for LDL. So they'll actually match people up essentially based on their LDL levels. So they'll look at people eating more or less saturated fat with the same LDL. And now everyone's going to have genetic differences. So that kind of eliminates the impact of saturated fat on your LDL, right? If A leads to B and B leads to C, but you just remove B as a variable altogether, you're never going to find that connection between A and C. And so that's a big issue that comes up in a lot of the research actually that's commonly cited there. And then the last one, there's a couple trials done on saturated fats versus like polyunsaturated fats, normally found in either vegetable oils, nuts, seeds, and those sorts of things, where they actually found possibly worse outcomes for the polyunsaturated fats. However, these were a couple trials done in like the 60s and 70s where they were using margarines that were full of trans fats. And that was before we knew a ton about trans fats. And so if you're replacing saturated fat with polyunsaturated fats, but these polyunsaturated fats just happen to come packaged with all this trans fat, that's obviously going to lead to worse outcomes, because trans fats are even worse than saturated fats. So that's really where all of that, or almost all of that confusion comes from, is from those few issues there.
That's so insane how like the fuse really made a very lasting impact. And I guess it kind of stems to us, the society and humans that we hear what we want to hear,
Yeah.
that paradox. And look, that being said, there's a lot of information that can be so convoluted and mixed up with different messages. I wanted to know from Nagra himself, what are some things that you've done in your life that you think are super health promoting and you've made a habit out of it?
Oh, there's so much. I don't even know where to start with that. I mean, I've always been into sports and stuff, so I couldn't say that that's new. I'd say I'm, especially over the past year with not being able to play soccer and not being able to go to gyms as much and stuff. I've got a little home gym set up right next to me here. So I'm keeping up with that sort of thing. But as far as just habits, I think over the years, since I first went plant-based over 10 years ago to now, I've really dialed in the sort of diversity in my diet. So, but early on, there might have been days where I was eating a couple types of foods throughout the day, or at least food groups, and not mixing up all that much. Whereas now I get decent servings of my fruits, my vegetables, my whole grains, my legumes, my nuts and seeds. Like I'm hitting all of those basically every day now, just out of habit. Like I just know what I like for breakfast, what I like for lunch. Dinner's kind of a toss up. It can be various. But I've got a pretty good setup now, just with grocery shopping and everything, where I know exactly what I'm going to get. I've got a few options I can prep for dinner at on pretty short timeline. If I'm not feeling like doing anything too elaborate. So I'd say that's something that has come with time, maybe more than others.
I love that. And look, you touched on groceries. I'm wondering if you go organic or if you go like conventional.
I don't really choose one over the other. Actually, most of the time I'll go for conventional over organic, just because I'm not really convinced of the data for organic. It seems like for health outcomes, there's no real difference. For nutrition, there's little to no difference there. Plus, ends up being a lot more cost effective. There are some cases where certain things will only be available organic. Like I know the smoked tofu I get, for example, I believe I can only get the organic one. I mean, I'm going to get that, of course. So I'm not too picky. I know there's some people that are picky one way or the other. I just kind of get whatever's available to me. I'm not too concerned about organic versus non-organic, which is something I used to be very in favor of. I used to be very in favor of organic, and since looking more at the data, I've kind of moved away from that, and it's a little better on the wallet too.
Yeah, it's a shame that organic's such a big difference, but I guess what I find fascinating on that, if I were to add my own opinion, is when you're shopping and you're voting for your dollar, you're not just kind of voting for what goes in your body, but also the environmental implications. On the health side, I know from what I've read, it's mainly like the polyphenols and the resveratrol and the organic foods that are of higher value. Yeah. How much higher it is, that's arguable, whether it's like you'd rather just eat more than buy organic. But I definitely see where you're coming from.
But on that note, I'd like to add something. So with regard to environmental impacts and things, you're talking about voting with your dollar. So here's one thing that might shock a lot of people. When you buy organic, whether you intend to or not, you are almost guaranteed to be feeding money into animal agriculture. And the reason is because they don't use synthetic fertilizers.
Right, manure.
They use manures. Yep. So it's still not a lot of money going into there, but you are actually choosing to put money into that, unless you're getting veganically farmed stuff, which you can. I mean, there's a farm here on Vancouver Island, I know that does that, but for the most part, you're almost guaranteed to be feeding money into animal ag one way or the other. And so, like, again, there's that give and take. That these are things to think about, and that's probably something most people haven't heard before.
Yeah, for sure. I know that with the data. I was reading a huge article, I think it was by the IPCC, and they were saying if you want to purchase things that are friendly for climate change, you can't be against GMOs because we cannot feed, and this is such a shame, but like you cannot feed the population that we're getting without using hydroponics and manipulated food to which they grow in certain conditions, in certain climates. So it's such a big argument, but I feel like there's no one right answer, which is worse.
I don't think there's a super strong case to be made for one or the other. That's why I'm kind of like, it's a toss up, do what you want kind of thing, with regard to that. I think organic is marketed a lot heavier than it probably should be for a lot of things. And at the same time, I don't think there are really harms associated with conventional produce if that's what someone wanted to go for. Whereas, again, that's something that is propagated a lot in online space. We're probably angering a lot of people just listening to this right now, to be honest. I feel like it's such a passionate topic, but
people are passionate, but like also based on how we're not like one on either side. You could probably sway us, but it's very subjective. It's like, what are you trying to accomplish, you know? On that topic, what's your thought on like cellular agriculture and that whole thing? I know Canada's got heaps like going on over there.
So actually, I haven't been following it too closely over here. I know in Singapore they approved it and everything. I'd like to see what happens when it's scaled up. You know, like cost wise, what's it like and everything. I think environmentally, definitely compared to, and then ethically, of course, compared to actually producing animals and killing them for food that way. I think this is certainly a better option. I also think there's potential there to modify them in ways or select for them in ways that can possibly improve the health profile. Maybe we can grow meat essentially that is maybe a bit lower in saturated fat, lower in cholesterol and those things as well. I think there's potential there, but then you're going to get some of what's the word, like neophobia around it, fear of this kind of new product, modified product and all of that. So I don't know. It's not something I plan to eat. I don't plan to at all. I've stayed away from animal products for 10 years now. I don't think I need anything else. But as far as for the public, for environmental health, I think it can definitely be a really good thing.
Are you a subscriber to more a whole foods plant-based diet than a vegan diet?
So I'm both. I am vegan, for sure, ethically and everything. That's how my ethics align. But definitely I focus on whole plant foods. That's not to say that there aren't some healthy processed foods. Obviously there's vinegars, there's nutritional yeast, soy milk, tofu. These are all mildly processed foods and all very, very healthy. But generally, I think the majority of our food intake for ideal health should probably come from whole plant foods.
You touched on soy milk for a second. This is a question I had that I haven't been able to find the answer to. Obviously, when we're talking about healthy, it's always paired with compared to what. Yeah. We know like you got soy, almond, coconut, insert all these different plants. They're all, from my research, better than dairy. But as a standalone, do you think these plant milks are a nutritious food?
Oh, soy milk especially is nutritious. And actually, most of these plant milks, if you're buying them in a grocery store, they're going to be fortified as well. So they'll be a good source of calcium, good source of probably a few other, especially B vitamins and that kind of thing. So I think they're incredibly nutritious. Soy milk is the best probably as far as mineral content, protein content, and all of that as well. It's the only one recommended by the American Academy of Pediatrics for children after age 1. It's the only one or only plant milk recommended by the new USDA dietary guidelines as well. It's the one definitely where I think most guidelines are behind it because the data and the nutrient profile is pretty strong.
I mean, you mentioned the USDA guidelines. Obviously, there was a huge change. I believe it was early this year, and they've added in that soy milk. I think with the Canada one, dairy actually isn't even in there anymore. Yeah. What would you like to see in the dietary guidelines that isn't in there at the moment?
So, I mean, I like ours. I really like it. It's like quarter your plate, whole grains, quarter your plate. They call it like protein foods, but they emphasize plant-based protein sources. And then they have half your plate fruits and veggies. I think as a general rule, that's solid. I do think possibly they could add in something there for like snacks and give like nuts and seeds or something like that, just for a little, just to emphasize a little bit of those polyunsaturated fats and whatnot, because they aren't really showcased there anywhere except in maybe small amounts in the protein section. But like that's a nitpick. I think for the most part, our guidelines are really solid. As a general rule, pretty much everybody anyway is going to be cooking with a lot of the like, olive oils, canola oils, those sorts of things anyway. So they'll be getting some fats in that way. So I don't know that I would like to see a whole lot changed. I think for the USDA guidelines, there was some weird categorization of foods this time around. And like you mentioned the soy milk in the dairy section. And I think they put, if I remember correctly, they put soy in the nuts category rather than the protein. Oh no, it was all the legumes maybe they put in the vegetable category instead of the protein category or something. It was there was some weird, very, very weird categorizations there. I can't remember them off the top of my head, but I just remember scratching my head at that one. it just wasn't as user friendly. Whereas if you look at Canada, it's just a plate, super easy picture. Here's the foods, and there you go. Right? It's really easy to follow.
I love that. And look, obviously, like you mentioned before, you follow a more whole foods diet. What advice would you have for someone who's potentially, like, I know for me, a lot of years, I didn't really know what whole foods was. Like, is it like pasta, like a whole pasta instead of like a crushed part? Like, I didn't comprehend that. What advice would you give to someone that's looking to start that route?
So yeah, you're right with things like pasta is technically not whole foods. There's leeway there for like whole grain products. I would just break it down into categories. I would say if you're looking to adopt a whole foods plant-based diet, just split up into, I think there's 5 categories here: fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes, nuts, and seeds. Those are your 5 categories. Make sure you pick from each of those as often as you can, hopefully daily. And that's going to be going a long way to really cover your bases as far as just overall health goes. And then obviously you can change a little bit based on individual. If you're allergic to nuts, don't eat nuts, of course, figure it out that way, whatever works for you. But I think that's kind of a good general rule. Of course, B12 supplements are important depending on where you live. Vitamin D supplements might be important. But I'd say pretty easy to figure out from there.
I love that. And look, as a man who digests a lot of literature a lot, do you still come across studies and data that surprises you?
No, I mean, yeah, sometimes stuff will come out that surprises me, but most of the time when it surprises me, I'll like go through it and I'll be like, oh, that's why, there's something going on there that maybe isn't caught in the headlines and that kind of thing. But a lot of the time it's just research coming out reaffirming what I've already, known. Or like there was a recent randomized trial I posted about on the ketogenic diet and animal-based ketogenic diet in healthy individuals. Horrendous results as far as like cardiovascular risk goes.
Talk about it. Let's do it.
Yeah. Okay. So there's 24 women, healthy, normal weight, which is actually funny. Is what a lot of the group of people that are adopting it seem to be kind of that group as well. The one thing though is they were hoping to maintain weight for the trial, so they pitted basically this keto diet against a dietary guidelines based diet in Sweden, I believe, and they had them follow the diets for 4 weeks, then return to the regular diets for 15 weeks, and then repeat the opposite diet for 4 more weeks. And the keto group shot up their LDL compared to the guidelines group by like 1.82 millimoles per liter. So for people who don't know like how significant that is, it is absurd. It is absolutely absurd. That the biggest increase for one girl was like up to 2.4 or something, or that big of a difference. Now my total LDL is like, I don't know, 1.5, 1.6 or something. And like, so my total LDL, and actually the average for, depending on which study you look at, average vegan LDL is less than literally just the change in LDL that they experienced on the keto diet. Like that is just terrifying for cardiovascular risk. And so that was not good. The rest of their markers, their triglycerides went up a little bit. Most of their other, their blood sugars stabilized a little bit. Of course, if you're not eating any carbohydrates, you'd expect that. But with their cardiovascular risk shooting through the roof, I mean, what's the point? And then they did another analysis from that same trial looking at physical performance. And the keto diet group had shorter time to exertion, so they weren't able to exercise as long, greater fatigue, I think, throughout the day. They had like 7 people drop out of the trial because of side effects like like fatigue and I think maybe headache and nausea and some other stuff as well. So there were some side effects there.
Is that from like depleted glycogen stores?
It could be that. Yeah. I mean, there's a few things. I can't remember. They hypothesized a few things in the trial, but it could be that. It could be, I mean, if you're abruptly changing your diet like that too, it could be a little bit of a learning curve there to get back or to get to utilizing the fats properly like that. But at the same time, they did give them 4 weeks on each diet. So it's just, it was pretty horrendous to see that. And it was just funny because when I was reading it too, I was thinking, this is probably the closest thing to a carnivore style diet that they've done. It was like 33% saturated fat. It was primarily animal based, 77% fat or something like that. Of course, they were still having some plant foods. If you talk to the carnivore proponents, they'll say, oh, that's why they were doing poorly. Because a little bit of plants in it.
I was thinking before when you said like the LDL shot up, I'm like, you have someone else read that. I'm like, oh, that's amazing. They're healthy individuals.
Yeah, exactly. No, it's just terrible. So that was one. And then as another one just came out, another trial just came out yesterday. Oh no, I just saw it yesterday. I don't know. It came out in this past week. Looking at soy protein versus whey protein in trained soccer athletes. They were young men, about 21 years old or something. And they had them supplement either whey protein or placebo, and they looked at outcomes. And lo and behold, no difference between the soy and the whey. If anything, the soy group actually showed improvement with one marker that the whey protein didn't. So if you wanted to really try to make an argument for soy, I guess you could, but I think it's a pretty irrelevant marker there. My stance on different protein sources like that is that they're just equivalent. The data is very clear on that. Plant versus animal protein doesn't matter as long as you're getting the same amount, overall same amount of leucine, which again, soy is a decent source of. It just doesn't matter. So that was another thing, just supporting the position that I already had, supporting the same sort of thing I've been saying for a really long time now.
I mean, that I love all that. And it makes me, I don't know, we don't have to look very far to find evidence that plants are kind of the best thing to go. Like I would be very shocked if one thing came out, people following a plant-based diet had higher rates of cardiovascular disease. Like, come on, you won't see that even if it's funded by big chicken. Like how do they even, anyway.
It would be a reverse. I mean, you could, if you really wanted to, you could probably conduct this trial like that. It'd be reverse causation though. You'd take people who are sicker, who have just recently, like they had heart disease and they changed their diet to a more plant-based diet to help with that. You could maybe make them look worse in that case, but that would be the only thing I could really think of here.
I think they had something similar where they found that vegans and vegetarians had higher stroke risks, which was with individuals that I think were beyond 45 years old that were following an animal-based diet for their whole life. And then they recently switched. And I think that was the case.
Actually, so on that one, on the stroke study, that was from 2019, I think. So if you look at the ages, when they cut off the age at either 70 or 75, wherever they censored it, the risk was only in people, in vegetarians older than 75. So if you compared the vegetarians to the meat eaters below 75, there was no difference in risk. On top of that, if you separate the vegans from the vegetarians, there was no difference in risk. And so the question is, well, why are these older individuals having higher stroke rates? And let's be clear, the difference in stroke risk was like 3 per 1,000 people or something, whereas the difference in heart attack risk, where the meat eaters were having higher heart attack risk, was like 7 out of 1,000. So, or 10 of 1,000. So there was a 7 per 1,000 benefit for the vegetarians. Now, the reason that we would suspect that the vegetarians had higher stroke risk, primarily driven by hemorrhagic stroke, which is a specific type of stroke, the less common one, and it's more common in older age, is because the vegetarians may have been living longer. And if they're not less likely to have a heart attack, which they were, they are more likely to have a stroke later on because they're more likely to live through that, live on, and get to the ages where hemorrhagic stroke is a bigger issue, as well as the fact that if you have a heart attack and die, well, you're not going to have a stroke. So that's actually probably a better explanation for why there was that stroke risk there. And then later that same year, there was another trial from Taiwan that came out that adjusted for heart disease. So they made sure that they created a level playing field there. And guess what? The vegetarians had a lower risk of stroke compared to the meat eaters, but that got zero press, zero media attention. And then more recently, a couple weeks ago, a new study came out looking at plant food or plant-based dietary index and stroke risk, and they found that the higher healthy plant-based dietary index, so this is looking at, again, more whole plant foods, lower risk of stroke. So really the evidence is pointing towards, if anything, there actually being a benefit there. It's just there are some kind of statistical issues that were going on with that previous study from Epic Oxford.
Right. Thank you for that explanation. I will listen to this 3 times to remember that when I'm talking to someone. And look, being in the field as well, talking to people, what's the most frustrating thing that you have to generally deal with?
Oh my God. Have you seen my, you've seen my misinformation highlights on my Instagram, or like when
I have.
So that's it. It's 100%. So I don't seek people out on Instagram to like be like, oh, by the way, you're wrong. I mean, that's not my goal here. But people tag me all the time. I have followers who will tag me like, oh, what do you think of this? It's confusing. And that's the problem, is that people get confused by this contrasting information. So I'll almost always just reach out and be like, actually, this is, some of the data I've seen. This is what it says. Where are you getting your information from? Just something along those lines. It's very innocent. I'm not trying to attack anybody. And then sometimes based on that, I'll just get blocked. Other times they'll go to my profile, see who I am, and they'll be like, "Oh, you're vegan, so your position, your comments are irrelevant," something like that. With like, I was just asking for information. It should be very easy to provide me with a reference, right? And then other times they'll actually try to argue, and a lot of times they'll just send 10, 15 references thinking that it's just too much for me or something. But good thing I've got time and I can go through it. So I'll go through the individual, references that they leave. And I'll be like, well, this says this, this says this, this says this. None of it supports your point. And we'll go back and forth a bunch, and they will never admit when they're wrong. Which is fine. I made a whole post about things I've been wrong about because I think it's important for people to know that it's okay to be wrong.
What have you been wrong about?
I'll get to that in a second. But I made a whole post about it. And then the other thing is, oftentimes if they're going back and forth, they're clearly avoiding some questions I'm asking. They're not tracking the conversation. I'll just be like, look, let's have a verbal discussion. Let's do an IG live or something. Then both of our audiences, usually they've got a pretty big following too, and we'll be like, both our audiences can learn from it or something. And it's always just silence at that point. There's no following through. And so that's really frustrating because that they aren't genuine. They aren't willing to change their views. They aren't genuinely interested in accuracy. They're more interested in ego and wanting to present themselves as being super accurate with the information and that. And so that's by far easily the most frustrating thing I ever deal with. And it's like all the time. And I don't even post them all, to be honest. I post some of the conversations because I think people can learn from them, how individuals can spread their misinformation. But so that's it. Now, as for things I've been wrong about, there were some. So I used to be really in the camp of how plant-based diets can reverse heart disease. I no longer believe it's actually been shown to do so. I believe the measures that were used in those trials actually weren't adequate to tell us whether or not reversal truly happened based on the data I now know. That's not to say that it's not possible that something will show that down the road, possibly, if we get more robust data and it shows unequivocally that we can actually reduce plaque size and that kind of thing. Hey, that's great. I'll post about it. I'll change my view again. Other things, I used to be more in the camp that just oils in general were harmful, whereas now I definitely am firmly in the camp that things like extra virgin olive oil, cold pressed canola oil, those sorts of things can definitely be a part of a healthy diet. What else? I don't know. I wrote some other stuff. Dairy and bone health. I used to be in the camp that poor or dairy consumption is associated with poor bone health, but actually it seems that that association is confounded by vitamin D status. So if you look at this is a common claim, countries that consume the most dairy have the poorest bone health. Well, they also tend to be the countries with the lowest sun exposure. And so they're more likely to have vitamin D deficiency, and then that can lead to it. So when you control for vitamin D status, you actually don't see a change there in risk. So those are just a few. I mean, I'm sure there's others as well, but definitely as time goes on and I learn more and more, I'll change my views on more things.
Your dairy thing just blew my mind because I'm definitely at the moment in the camp that I associated dairy consumption with poor bone health, and specifically from the Scandinavian studies that they show higher consumption of dairy. But they also have lots of other factors. You're right. So I've also heard that dairy is quite acidic. Is that true?
No, not that I'm aware of anything like that. I mean, there's a bunch of claims made about dairy that are false. I mean, as far as health goes, if I was to give you the quick rundown, so fatty dairy products increase cardiovascular risk. So that's an issue with that. Low fat dairy products, if anything, do the opposite there. Dairy as a whole seems to increase risk of prostate cancer, particularly milk consumption. But then at the same time, dairy reduces risk of colorectal cancer. So there's a give and take there. Dairy increases risk of Parkinson's, but decreases risk of Alzheimer's disease. So again, there's kind of a give and take. Now, if we're talking about the benefits of dairy as far as lowering prostate cancer risk, lowering Alzheimer's disease risk, we can do that in other ways. We can lower our prostate cancer risk by drinking a soy milk. Soy reduces prostate cancer risk. We can reduce our risk, that was an increase so for colorectal cancer, a fortified soy milk or something because of the high calcium content. Sorry, I got that backwards. And then as far as the Alzheimer's, well, again, we know we have tons of data on, again, whole plant food sort of diets and reducing risk, whether it's the MIND diet or even more plant-based diets than that. So so the benefits from dairy we can achieve other ways, but there are still those few risks. The risks that often get promoted, especially in plant-based circles, are far overblown. I think if anything, like meat is very consistently associated with just poor health outcomes for the most part, whereas dairy has some benefit.
Okay. Well, that just blew my mind a little bit. I'm so shocked, especially because, a lot of documentaries, without naming them, are very anti-dairy. And I guess that's, if you're not in the field, that's kind of all the exposure you have, and you just kind of trust in these figures to give you the right information. So
yeah, and what's so funny about that is, and I get this too, because in my field, there's a lot of people who are just not for vegan diets or plant-based diets at all. There's a lot of kind of anti-vegan rhetoric in this field. But what I get a lot of is these individuals will be totally fine with being like passionately anti-dairy. Even sometimes I'll ask them for data for some of the stuff that they say regarding dairy, and they just don't really have it. But at the same time, they'll be so pro-meat. And like, so to be so pro-meat, but so anti-dairy just shows such a disconnect with the science. Whereas I don't think we need either. And I think both come with adverse health effects or possibly adverse impact on our health, especially if we're talking about fatty dairy products. But to say that dairy is somehow like the devil, but meat is okay, just blows my mind. I don't know how anyone comes to that conclusion, because we actually have data on swapping dairy for meat, and meat seems to worsen outcomes there too. So it's just crazy.
That's insane. Look, and a lot of the time we're talking about a plant-based diet, and that can have effects such as weight loss, lowering your saturated fat, and there's heaps of things that come with it. How does it actually do that? Like, is it a combination of things? Is it the fact that you're reducing your meat? Is it the fiber? Like, what is it in plants if we were to get a few things that really give us the health outcomes that we get?
So it depends what health outcome we're talking about. But if we're talking about like heart disease, you mentioned saturated fat and that. Well, for one, you're getting rid of the saturated fat or reducing. So that's huge. You're also increasing polyunsaturated fats typically if you're eating especially nuts, seeds, or vegetable oils. And that can actually do the opposite of what saturated fat does to your cholesterol levels. So it can help drop it. At the same time, a lot of the fiber consumption, fiber is associated with just amazing health outcomes. It's very robust data. The fiber can help with lowering cholesterol. It can help with blood sugar control. It can help with all sorts of different things there, and reduce risk of all-cause mortality. We've also got all the antioxidants and polyphenols and all these other compounds, phytonutrients that, again, are just, they're all associated with positive health outcomes. Although when we isolate them and take them in a pill form, they don't seem to do the same thing, right? So there is a synergy there that they're all, it's important for them to work together. But I would suggest that there's just so much there that is of benefit, and that we don't even know them all. Like, we don't know all the phytonutrients and what they do and how they work together. We just know that they're there, and there's hundreds or possibly thousands of them, and so we definitely want to be consuming those whole plant foods.
I love that. And look, you touched on fiber. This is hilarious. I don't know if you watched that video that went viral of the episode of The Doctors, and Garth Davis is on there, and they were saying fiber has no shown benefit at all. Like, where do they get that? I don't understand.
I have no idea. I mean, there's this like Lancet publication that came out, I think it was 2019, maybe 2020. That's just unbelievably huge, so robust, so much information, showing, again, fiber just associated with fantastic health outcomes. We even have data going from like basically no fiber to some fiber showing benefit. It's not even a high fiber intake. It's just crazy to think that that there isn't that fiber hasn't been shown to be benefit. We even have randomized trials on like fiber supplementation in certain outcomes, especially gut-related outcomes. It's just that's an absurd claim.
It was hilarious. And look, I respect Garth for actually giving them a bit of piece of their mind. But talking about studies, do you have like a wish list of a study or paper that you wish someone would conduct?
Yeah, I have a couple. So So do you know what a substitution analysis is? Should I explain that?
Please.
Yeah. So substitution analyses are where you look at, they're like a lot of the data we have, but you look at different foods, and we have some from the past couple of years looking at like different animal protein sources. So red meat, processed meat, poultry, fish, eggs, but then certain plant foods, legumes, nuts, seeds, whole grains. And you look at what happens to your health when you swap certain ones. So if you were to replace 3% of your calories from a certain animal protein source with 3% of your calories from a certain plant protein source, what would happen to your health outcomes? Or you can do it by serving as well. And they're fantastic for answering that question of compared to what, right? This improves health compared to certain things, but maybe not compared to others. And so those are great. I would love to see one, not just on dairy, but on cheese specifically. And that's because there seems to be a lot of debate around the impact of cheese on our cardiovascular risk. Now, we do have trials comparing cheese to either reduced fat cheese or to tofu, showing that it is worse for cardiovascular risk or for LDL levels. So I am convinced of that. But the degree to which I actually think it's probably less than some other animal products. So I would like to see how much of a difference that really makes, especially when we look at hard health outcomes. So that's one.
Would you go as deep as like comparing cheddar to mozzarella?
Oh, I mean, if they can get enough data for that, sure, that would be a tough one. You'd need a lot of people to do that, but I'd love to see something like that. Another one is we recently had a trial looking at animal protein versus plant protein and like strength and muscle gains. And of course, no difference. But once again, you've got a lot of the online fitness community talking about how they took supplements, though, even though the meat eating group took supplements too. And just really ridiculous claims like that to kind of cast doubt into the fact that plant protein is the same. So I would love to see one where they have people eat enough protein strictly from food sources, so not supplemental sources. I would love to see how that works out. I feel like I probably got some other ones. I've got a couple of friends. We go back and forth with this stuff all the time. One of them's hopefully working towards his PhD, so he can help conduct some of this research. So we have a list, I think, of a few of them, but those are a couple I can think of off the top of my head.
I love that. I'd love to see that cheese one. But like it kind of brings about, I guess, a mixture or a question, like you said before, where studies can be quite, I guess, reductionist at looking at just one thing. But when you eat the plant instead of the pill form, it's a different outcome.
Yep.
Is there, like in the substitution study that you're talking about, does that, I guess, address the fact that you can change this one thing, but couldn't other things be at play? Like how can you reduce extraneous variables?
Oh, so they do that. So they do really complex statistical analyses for that. They adjust for smoking status, physical activity, income, education level, menopausal status, parity. It's like on and on and on and on. They do that. That's something I get that a lot. They're like, oh, well, this is epidemiology, and you never know. You can't control for these factors, and that really showcases that this individual hasn't actually looked at the data, because they, for the most part, and pretty much anything I'm going to cite goes above and beyond to do this. And if anything, usually the bigger issue is that over adjustment problem I mentioned before, adjusting for factors that are directly in that pathway of the food to whatever the disease outcome is. And so if anything, like, look, we can look at meat intake and cardiovascular risk and adjust for body weight and still find that there's a risk there. We know based on trials that we have that typically meat consumption is actually associated with a higher body weight. So you're actually removing that factor and there's still a risk. And so if anything, doing these adjustments mitigates the risk. It's not accentuating. We're not accentuating the risks in these studies. If anything, we're actually mitigating the amount of risk we would normally see, and we still see a risk. And so that's why I think that there's just a bit of a misunderstanding about how all that works.
Yeah, I love that. Thanks for that rundown. What is your best advice for the average Joe who wants to take maybe their health to the next level? Like, what's the smallest change they can make that'll have the biggest impact?
Smallest change. That's almost like you're asking me about superfoods or something. No,
I mean, I say the word smallest, but let's get rid of that word.
Okay. Yeah. So, I think it depends on where you're at. I take a couple different approaches with people depending on where they're starting. If they're, let's say they're eating, they're somewhat interested in their health, they're eating decent, but there's room for improvement, I would just work on those simple swaps. So if they're normally eating, let's say they're doing their pasta with like meat sauce for dinner, we'll just swap out the meat sauce for tomato sauce, swap out the pasta for either a legume pasta or a whole wheat pasta. You've already made it that much healthier. If you want to go to the next step, you chop up some veggies, throw it in the sauce as well. You're having the same meal, you've just changed the ingredients, right? You can do that kind of same thing for most meals, unless the meal is literally centered on a piece of maybe food or meat or like bacon for breakfast or something. And then you got to just revamp that altogether. But for the most part, you can swap out these little things. Now, if you're somebody who's going from what you would call a standard American diet and you're wanting to start making changes, I think starting with one meal at a time is the way to go. Figure out your breakfast. Try the oatmeal tofu scramble. Try even toast. Try whatever. There's smoothies. There's a bunch of different sorts of recipes and things you can try, and just try to nail that breakfast, right? Make sure you've done a variety of different foods. You've tried them out. You know what you like. You do it for a couple of weeks, and then once you've nailed that, then you can move on to lunch, and then you move on to dinner. So I mean, whatever steps you take, like I mentioned earlier, there's going to be some benefit there, and you don't need to really stress about it.
I love that. Taking a step off food for a second, what's your philosophy on exercise?
Generally, up to a point, the more the better. I feel like even our guidelines around that are a bit underwhelming as far as what are they, like 20 or 30 minutes a day of moderate intensity activity or something. I think for exercise, really the best type of exercise is the one you're actually going to do. Different people like different things. There's dancing, there's soccer like myself, there's martial arts, there's weightlifting, there's running, whatever you like to do, that's what you should be doing. Now, if we're talking about for ideal health, I do think a mix of resistance training and cardiovascular activity is probably best. But at the same time, I find a lot of time individuals are just starting to get into physical activity. They're just going from no activity to some activity. In that case, I would just pick whatever you like doing, whatever you think you can do on a regular basis that you'll look forward to. That's the way to go.
I love it. I want to help out the people who don't know science very well for a second. And that's sometimes me included, especially when I have blanks. Do you have a study that you look at or you cite consistently when someone's like, nah, veganism and plant-based is unhealthy? Like, is there a way you can say, like, almost like an elevator pitch, like kind of like slapping them, but with words?
Yeah. So there would be two that I go to. In 2017, there was a meta-analysis on vegetarian and vegan diets and health outcomes. Vegetarians had, I believe, a 25% lower risk of ischemic heart disease compared to meat eaters. The vegans specifically had a 15% lower risk of cancer compared to meat eaters. There were no risks there associated with either diet. And so that's kind of the accumulation of the data that we have. However, there's also a study done in the UK where they pooled a bunch of data looking at vegetarians and vegans compared to comparable meat eaters. So these weren't like super unhealthy meat eaters that they were comparing to. They're generally more healthy people. And they found that when you only look at long-term vegans and vegetarians, right? So this really trumps the argument. When you only look at the long-termers, those who weren't switching their diets during the study, they found that vegans and vegetarians had a lower risk. I think it was about a 14% lower risk of dying before age 75 than the meat eaters, and an 8% lower risk of dying before age 90 than the meat eaters. That is pretty astonishing, I think. That is one of the best studies that we have because they took that extra step to control for those diet switchers and people that are changing it up.
Would you say like the blue zones are a good use of like how plants can be good?
I think so, but we have to remember that yes, their dietary patterns are all similar, but they also have other lifestyle habits. They're regularly physically active. They have a good sense of community, relationships, all of that as well. So it's not just diet. So we have to kind of be careful with that.
Yeah. Let's look at this lifestyle part that you just mentioned with the blue zones. When we're looking at health as like a whole thing, it's obviously not just diet, although you can't outrun a bad diet in a lot of cases. You've got exercise, you've got community, friends, family, love, career, all of that. Do you follow some sort of like mindfulness practice?
That's something that I think I could probably improve on. I don't have a regular regimented meditation practice or anything like that. For example, I do like journaling. I often, although not as much lately, although weather's getting better, I do go out for walks in the woods by myself and that kind of thing. It's always good for that as well. But as far as a regular regimented, like before bedtime or anything like that, I don't right now.
I love that. Look, coming towards the end, it's been an absolute pleasure here to have you. Do you have any words of Matthew Nagra advice? It could be related to what we're talking about today. It could be something completely unrelated about soccer or something. I don't know. Look, the platform is all yours to speak your mind.
I would just say that you need to remember why you want to make these changes. I think that's something I work on with my patients a lot, is understanding why they want to make the change, because that's the motivator. And obviously if you're doing this for yourself, you don't have someone like me to push you that way. But when I know what someone's motivation is, I can always remind them of that. And so I think that's huge for helping people stick to something long term. And if they fall off the wagon, if you want to use that term, it's not the greatest term, but if they do kind of fall off at some point, get right back on. It's not a big deal. We all make mistakes at some point, or we'll have challenges along the way. So I just think, remember why you want to make changes, why you want to improve your health, whether it's to reduce chronic disease risk, to be around for your grandkids, to whatever it may be, and to not beat yourself if you quote unquote mess up at some point.
I love that. And I always like to finish my episodes with a deep thank you to you, obviously on behalf of myself as a human being on this lovely floating rock, but also on behalf of the Plant Paradigm community. I want to thank you genuinely for, speaking out about the power of plant-based. Not only does it give people the correct information in an unbiased way so they can make the decision make the most informed decision so that they can have a long life and they can spend more time with their friends and family and doing what they love and not feeling like crap and just living off coffee because they think that's the only way to get energy. And obviously because of that as well, thank you on behalf of the animals and the planet who, because of those decisions that these people are making, we're now having a more safe environment for greenhouse gas emissions and all of that. So I really thank you for what you're doing. And I know you have to deal with a lot of frustrations. A lot of us have to do our little part, and you especially so. So thank you so much for that. And thank you again for your time today.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for all those kind words and for having me and letting me spread this message.
Hi there. Welcome to the end of the episode. What a great chat. Dr. Nagra he's just as knowledgeable as I thought he'd be. And he kind of exceeded all expectations. Like, how does someone remember all that? He's really dived into the world of nutrition. And that's amazing. And I loved getting the tips and knowledge from someone who's really into it, but then in a way, gotten that information so that we can share that with our friends and family. I couldn't remember all the science that he was talking about. So I'll definitely be listening to this episode a few times, but also this is a great resource to send to people that maybe are a little bit plant curious or want to know what's up with this plant-based diet. What we talked about, I think, was in a way not very attacking. Of course, we just talked about the facts. I definitely learned a few new things, especially the dairy thing. I plan on looking into that a lot more because that kind of shocked me a little bit. But like I said, this is an amazing resource to send to people friends, family, colleagues who are interested in the plant-based diet, or maybe who are already plant-based but need some more information and talking points so that they can also relay that information onto their friends and family and colleagues, so we can all together take control of our health and obviously have a lifestyle that is friendly to the planet and friendly to the animals. If you want to help out the podcast, one other thing you can do is, of course, any shares on social media or Instagram stories or things like that. But also a 5-star review would be amazing. But that is all from me today. I'm actually going to take a month break. So there'll be no podcast coming out in May. But I'm working on something special that will hopefully be back in June when I do come back with, of course, weekly episodes, because there are plenty of interviews I'll be doing in May. I just need some time to get some other things prepared that is plant paradigm related. Until then, stay happy, eat plants, peace.